In the village of Kessa, there lived a blacksmith named Kwabena, whose right hand had been burned by fire before he was old enough to properly remember the day it happened. The fire had taken his father's life, and in the years that followed, the village quietly decided it had taken something from Kwabena too. They called him the Cursed Smith, not to his face, but close enough to it that the words always found their way to him eventually. For 30 years, Kwabena lived at the edge of Kessa, mending what the village brought to his forge, asking nothing beyond a fair price, and returning to an empty house each night. What no one in Kessa knew, for 30 years, was where he went after that. Kwabena was 7 years old the night his father's forge caught fire. No one in Kessa agreed anymore on how it had started, whether a spark had leapt too far from the coals, or whether the wind that night had simply been unkind. What they agreed on was what happened after. That a boy of 7 had run into the burning forge to pull his father free, and had come out with his father's body and a hand that would never fully heal. His father did not survive the night. Kwabena did, marked from that day on in a way the village found difficult to look at directly. His mother had died bringing him into the world, so it was his father's older sister, Auntie Efwa, who took him in after the fire. A woman with little patience for superstition and even less money to spare, who fed him, clothed him, and told him plainly, more than once, that a village's fear said far more about the village than it ever would about him. She did not live to see him grown, but her words outlasted her, the way the right words said to a frightened child sometimes do. It should have made him beloved. A boy who tried at 7 years old to save his father from fire deserved by any fair measure sympathy and welcome. But grief in Kessa, as in many places, did not always move in the direction fairness would have chosen. Because it was easier, in the years that followed, to believe the fire had meant something, that it had marked the boy for a reason, than to accept that a good man had simply died, and his son had simply been unlucky enough to be there. The fire doesn't take a man and leave nothing behind, the elders murmured, in the specific way villagers murmur things they will deny saying if asked directly. It left its mark on the boy. Best to watch him. So they watched him, and they kept their distance while they did it. Children were taught, without anyone quite deciding to teach it, to walk a little faster past the forge, to avoid his eyes at the market, to let their parents' unspoken caution become their own before they were old enough to ask why. Kwabena grew up in his father's forge because it was the one place in Kessa that never asked him to explain himself. Metal did not care about omens. Fire, the very thing that had scarred him, remained the only thing that still spoke to him in a language he trusted completely. By the time he was a grown man, he was, by simple necessity, an excellent smith. Better, most admitted quietly, than Osifo, the village's other blacksmith, who had inherited his position more through his father's standing than his own skill at the forge. Osifo did not appreciate the comparison, and Osifo, unlike most of Kessa, understood exactly how useful a curse could be when a man needed his customers a little frightened of his only competition. "Would you trust a burned hand near your best tools?" Osifo would ask when the subject of Kwabena arose, never quite an accusation, always phrased as a reasonable question one neighbour might ask another. "I only ask what any careful man would ask." It was a small enough question to plant, but 30 years is a long time for a small question to grow roots. For 30 years, Kessa brought Kwabena its broken things only when it had no other choice. A plough that would not turn the soil, a blade too dull to be trusted with the harvest, a hinge that had rusted shut on the one door in the village that still needed to close properly. They came to him at the edge of the village, paid him fairly because even fear has its limits when a family's plough needs mending before planting season, and left as quickly as good manners allowed. Few ever asked him to sit. Fewer still asked him to eat. He had long since stopped expecting either. What Kessa did not know, because Kessa had long since stopped looking closely enough at him to know anything, was what Kwabena did in the hours after his forge went dark and the village went to sleep. It began in the way most quiet things begin, without any plan behind it. A widow named Ajoa, 3 houses from the forge, had a hoe with a head so loose it had nearly taken her fingers the week she needed it most, at the start of planting season, with no coin left after burying her husband to pay for its mending. Kwabena had heard, the way small villages make it impossible not to hear things, of her trouble. The next morning, Ajoa found her hoe at her doorstep, its head fixed more solidly than it had been in years. She never saw who left it. She asked, of course, asked everyone, for weeks, and no one admitted to anything, because no one had done anything, except a scarred man at the edge of the village, who had simply repaired what needed repairing and walked home before the light came up. It happened again, the following season, with a different family's plough. Then a broken gate hinge belonging to a man who had once, years before, called Kwabena the Cursed One to his own son within Kwabena's hearing. Kwabena mended it anyway. He always mended it anyway. Then, a few years after that, a ceremonial blade, passed down from a father to a son too young to have known him well before fever took him, arrived at Kwabena's forge indirectly. Carried by a widow named Serwa, who could not afford to have it properly restored before her son Kojo's coming-of-age ceremony, and who had resigned herself to the boy carrying a rusted, dishonoured blade in front of the whole village. The blade that appeared at her doorstep 3 mornings later gleamed as though it had never touched rust at all. Kojo carried it at his ceremony with a pride his mother had feared he would never get to feel. Neither of them ever learned that year who to thank. Over 30 years, this became, without any single dramatic moment marking its beginning, simply what Kwabena did. Quietly, at night, for families who could not afford Osafo's rising prices, and sometimes for families who had never once been kind to him. He left no mark of his work, no note, no request for thanks, because thanks, he had learned early, was not something Kessa was in the habit of offering him, and he had stopped needing it in order to keep going. If you had asked him why, in those years, he might not have had a tidy answer. He mended things because he could, because his hands, whatever the village believed about them, were good for exactly this. And because the alternative, becoming the bitter, dangerous thing 30 years of whispered suspicion might have made of a lesser man, was a fire he refused to let take anything else from him. In Kwabena's 30th year at the forge, riders came from the north with news that emptied the market before midday. A war band, displaced by a drought 2 territories over, and desperate in the particular way only displaced and desperate men become, was moving south along the river road. 3 villages in its path had already been stripped of grain and livestock. Kessa, the riders said, had perhaps 10 days before it lay in that same path. The village did not sleep well that week. Mothers counted their children twice at nightfall. Old men who had not spoken of the last such warband in decades found themselves speaking of little else. Chief Nana Boateng called the village together that evening, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, Kessa had to reckon honestly with what it actually possessed. It did not possess much. Osafo's forge, for all his standing in the village, had spent 30 years producing fine ceremonial ironwork and expensive commissions for families who could pay well. Not the unglamorous, constant work of keeping every farming family's tools and blades in fighting condition. Half the village's hoes could barely turn soil, let alone be reforged quickly into anything resembling a defence. Osafo himself stood before the chief that evening and admitted, for perhaps the first time in his life, that 10 days was not enough time to remake what 30 years of easy customers had let him neglect. "Bring everything that can hold an edge," the chief ordered. "Whatever is broken, whatever needs mending, bring it to the forges tonight." It was old Adjua, now bent with age but sharper than most gave her credit for, who noticed something the chief had not. "Mine already holds an edge," she said, turning her hoe over in her hands, the same hoe she had nearly lost her fingers to decades before. "It has held one for 30 years now. I never did find out why." She was not the only one. One family after another arrived at the gathering with tools that were, mysteriously, already sound. Hinges that should have rusted shut, blades that should have dulled with age, all somehow still serviceable, all belonging to families who had, at one time or another, been too poor to pay for such upkeep. The chief looked around the gathered village, and for the first time in 30 years, asked the question no one in Kessa had thought to ask. Who has been doing this? It was Adjua, in the end, who answered him, because Adjua, 3 years before, unable to sleep with an old woman's restless nights, had risen for water and seen, from her window, a familiar scarred hand kneeling at her doorstep in the moonlight, working silently over the very hoe she was now holding. She had said nothing about it all this time. She had simply understood, without needing an explanation, why a man who had been given so little reason to help his neighbours had chosen, again and again, to do it anyway. And she had understood, too, why he might not want that choice announced to a village that had never once thanked him for anything. But the North Road gave her no more room for keeping his secret. "Kwabena," she said. Just the name, into the gathered silence of the village square. "Ask Kwabena." Every head turned toward the edge of the crowd, where the blacksmith stood, as he always stood at village gatherings, near the back, expecting to be asked to leave before he was asked to stay. He did not deny it. He had never planned for a moment when denial might be necessary. 30 years, Osafo said quietly, into the silence. Not as an accusation this time, but as a man hearing, for the first time, the actual weight of a rumour he had spent decades finding useful. He did not finish the thought. He did not need to. Chief Nana Boateng crossed the square himself, the way Kwabena had watched other men cross toward Osafo's forge his entire life, and never once toward his own. Not out of curiosity, not out of gratitude, until tonight. "Why?" the chief asked. Only that. Kwabena considered the question longer than the chief expected. "A fire took my father from me before I understood what losing him meant," he said finally. This village decided, not long after, that the same fire had taken something from me too, that I should be watched and kept at a distance and quietly feared. I could not undo what the fire did to my hand, but I was not going to let what this village believed about it decide what kind of man I became. My father did not raise a bitter son. I was not going to let 30 years of your suspicion raise one instead. No one in the square answered him for a long moment. There was, perhaps, no answer generous enough to offer. Among the young men now looking at Kwabena for the first time as something other than a rumour was Kojo. No longer a boy, his father's restored blade now his own to carry, who was the first, that night, to walk to the forge's edge and stand beside him, though no one had asked him to. That night, and in the 10 nights that followed, Kessa prepared for the warband with every tool Kwabena had quietly kept sound for 30 years, and every tool he now mended openly, in daylight, with the whole village finally willing to stand and watch him work. The warband, when it reached the river road above Kessa, found a village armed and ready in a way its scouts had not anticipated, and turned south toward easier ground instead. Kessa remembered Kwabena differently after that season, though the storytellers who prefer tidy endings would want you to believe the whole village fell at his feet in gratitude and rewrote 30 years of neglect in a single night. It did not happen quite that cleanly. Old suspicion does not dissolve as fast as old danger arrives. But something did shift, quietly, the way most true things in Kessa seem to. Families began bringing their tools to his forge in daylight, without excuses. Children stopped repeating the word their parents had taught them without meaning to. And Osifo, who had built 30 years of business on a fear he had helped invent, found that fear finally too heavy a thing to keep selling. Kwabena never asked for any of it. He had long since stopped mending Kessa's tools in the hope of being thanked for it. Kojo, grown now, still carries his father's blade. Restored twice over, he likes to say. Once by strangers' quiet hands, and once by his own choice to finally call that stranger by name. They say in Kessa, even now, that the fire which took a father from a boy left one more thing behind that no one noticed for 30 years. That a mark on the hand does not have to become a mark on the heart, unless the one who carries it chooses every day to let it. Some resistance is loud enough to be seen from a distance, and some of it is only ever visible in the quiet work someone keeps choosing to do, long after anyone has given them a reason to. Thanks for watching. If you like my video, please subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon.